Bruce, I have the flu and I can't preach, and you're the only elder left. You got to come to church and preach today. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And I started having a panic attack. Every day being called to the ministry, I never know what's going to happen. I never know what's going to take place. I may think there's a meeting that's just a casual get together, and 40 minutes into it, the person drops a bomb. I never really understood my dad's calling. I remember asking him, why did you want to be a pastor? You could have done anything. And yet being a pastor is so hard. You don't make any money. It's constant criticism. And he said, I felt called. And I didn't understand his calling until the final days of his life.
Welcome to episode 1 of the Wayfaring Stranger podcast. In this first episode, I talked to my pastor, Pastor Bruce French. Bruce talks about the surprising journey God took him on to become a pastor in his early 30s, despite the fact that he was a graphic designer running a small company at the time. As the conversation unfolds, Bruce mentions how his wife played a pivotal role in his path to ministry, including a brief period of tension that existed between them when he was first considered for church leadership. He also mentions the unexpected passing of his father and the profound impact this had on his understanding of what being a pastor really was. And lastly, we talk about the idea of calling and how it's so much more than simply what one does for a living. I do hope that you enjoy this first episode of Wayfaring Stranger.
When Monica and I were dating and we started getting more serious, she asked me, do you have plans on being a pastor? I said, no way. I worked through that. I love being a graphic designer, have no intent whatsoever to do that. So we get married, everything's hunky-dory, and I'm getting more and more involved in ministry. So I started out teaching Sunday school. We did this class called 30-something, and it grew quickly. And then the senior pastor said, hey, we'd really like you to be on the elder board. And we were expecting our first child. And that was a big stretch. She was like, I don't think this is going to be good for our family. But we prayed about it. And shortly after Tyler was born, she agreed and I came on the elder board. Fast forward 4 years later, the chairman, who had been the chairman for 15 years, was moving to Oregon. And in an all-day planning meeting, the pastor and the chairman had already had a conversation, and they felt like that I should be the next chairman of the elder board. So I was 36 years of age, and it kind of surprised me. And so the afternoon ended, and I went home, and I told Monica, and I was excited about it, but I kind of had a feeling she was not going to be on board. And I was correct. She was adamantly opposed to it. And it led into this discussion where I said, I think we should pray about it. I feel like this is the stirring that's happening in my heart, is that God wants me to be a key member in leading this church. I said, how about we just pray about it for a month? And she goes, you pray about it, but I've already made up my mind. Well, one of the humorous things that happened, my dad was still a pastor at the time, and I called him up. And I said, Dad, I need your help with this. Monica will not budge, and I really feel like this is something God wants me to do. 7 elders, they all agreed this was a plan. And she had already called him, and she had already briefed with him. And he said, I hate to tell you, but I'm in her camp. I think she's right. I don't think this is the right time for you to do that. And I was really troubled by it. So basically, I went back the next meeting and I said, hey, my wife's having a hard time with this, and we need a few weeks to work this out. So another individual had said, if for whatever reason you can't come to agreement, I'm willing to step into that role. Well, one of Monica's arguments is that we have 2 small children, 2 and 4, and if something happens, something goes awry in the church, it becomes a huge burden, especially for the chairman of the elder board. And I couldn't argue with that, but things are going really well, and I just couldn't foresee that. Well, 3 or 4 weeks go by, and she's not changing. In fact, at one point, she was so upset. She had the kids in the car, and she said, you do whatever you want to do. I'm going to my mom and dad's, and I will take care of the kids. You do what you think you must. And I'd never seen her so upset. And there'd never been, in the 6 years of our marriage, ever been a time where we were at a place of division and an absence of peace. And as I prayed more about it, I felt like the Spirit was saying that this is not of me. To go from a place of harmony and peace and unity to a place of division and strife. And so I made the hard decision. I told the elder board I wasn't going to do it, that I would stay on the board, but I wasn't going to be the chairman. And so this other individual stepped into that role. Within 2 weeks of that happening, it was discovered that this associate pastor had an affair, and it blew up. The whole church was upset and hurt, and there was a question of how this could have happened, and now we had to make this decision of dismissing him, and it got really complex. But in the middle of that, I received a phone call on a Saturday from my brother, and he informed me that my dad had leukemia, and the doctors had only given him 3 to 4 weeks to live. And so it wasn't just one crisis, it was actually two happening simultaneously. And it was astonishing to me because clearly the Lord had spoken to Monica, and she had this premonition. And the two things that she had spoken about in kind of ambiguity actually came to fruition. And so now I'm flying home every weekend to Sacramento to help care for my dad in the closing days of his life. But what was so fascinating about that is that I never really understood my dad's calling. I remember asking him, why did you want to be a pastor? You could have done anything. And yet being a pastor is so hard. You don't make any money. It's constant criticism. And he said, I felt called. And I didn't understand his calling until the final days of his life. Because every weekend, people that he had ministered to for 30 years were coming into our house, and they'd tell me stories. I remember one lady said, my husband's been sober for 25 years, and your dad used to go to the bars at 12 o'clock at night and get him out of the bar and bring him home. And another young man told me that he was in med school and was planning on being a missionary doctor because my dad had led his grandfather to the Lord, and then his parents became Christians, and they'd raised him to follow the Lord. And I started realizing the impact that my dad's life as a church planner, never a mega church, had in countless individuals. And it started making sense to me. So my dad died on September 10th, and I had flown home the weekend of and was with him in his final hours. And his dying wish was that I would do his funeral. And I was like, I can't do that. First of all, that's incredibly emotional. Second of all, I'm not an experienced speaker. There's going to be hundreds of people from your denomination that are going to come to honor you. And he said, no, I wouldn't want anybody else but you to actually give the message at my service. So the 10th was a Monday. The funeral was on Saturday. And we decided to have just a family graveside service on Friday. And one of the things that was happening simultaneously is that I'd been running this graphic design company, graphic design and marketing, for probably about 4 years at that time. We were expanding and we started having international clients. And one of our big clients in Kansas City was Bosch and Lomb, Bushnell. And in the fall is when it would really ramp up. And so the day that I was burying my dad, the service was at 10. That morning I had a call from the owner and said, the package design that we got a contract, the first layout is due on Monday. You have to finish that today and get into FedEx. And I said, I'm burying my dad today, and tomorrow's his service. And he says, doesn't matter. If we're going to keep this contract, you've got to have it done. So after we did the service, I dismissed myself during lunch, went back to my parents' house, finished the layout for this design, got it to FedEx in time, and then spent the rest of the evening trying to prepare and gain my composure to speak at my dad's service. So God was gracious. He helped me. There was a tremendous support. I had a couple of my elders actually fly to Sacramento to be there. Friends that I went to high school with came, and they were so supportive. And one of them had become a Christian after we left high school, was now a pastor for Calvary Chapel. His name was Dominic Luca. And Dominic, after the service, said, you've got a gift. God's called you to be the ministry. I'm like, oh, no, that's not the case. And I said, I love what I'm doing. So the next day on Sunday, I left Monica and our two kids with my mom to help care for her, and I drove back to LA and went back to work. And one of the tragic ironies is that by the middle of that next week, they had canceled that particular package, and we weren't even going to do it. But God used that because it began to really crystallize my frustration where I was at in my career and the difficulties that I was having, the tension in my life. And so, as I'd mentioned, my dad died on September 10th. Monica and I's sixth anniversary was October 13th. And so I drove back up for that weekend to be with her. And I took her to this nice restaurant. And after we'd ordered, she handed me this envelope. And I opened the envelope with the anniversary card. But what she wrote in there, she said, "I will never stand between you and God ever again." And I said, "What do you mean? Why did you put that?" And she said, "After I heard you speak at your dad's funeral, I realized that you were not mine, you were God's, and that I didn't have any right to tell God that he couldn't use the gifts that he's given you." So I was really touched by it. I was comforted by it, but I said, "Well, I don't have any plans. I think you were right. I shouldn't have been the chairman of the elder board. That was not the right role for me." So I brought my family back to LA, and about a month later at an elder meeting, it was decided that they were going to actually relaunch the associate pastor position. And they were going to wait a few weeks and then they were going to post it. So I went home that night and I told her, I said, "I can't believe it. They're already going to repost that associate position." And she said, "Do you think you should apply for it?" I said, "No, why would I want to apply for that?" She says, "I just feel like God's doing something in your life and in our family. And I think we should pray about it." I said, "Okay, fair enough." So I said, "I want to put a fleece out though." And my fleece was, as I said, they're not going to post it for another 7 weeks. And I want to have 6 people come to me who don't know about the position to suggest that I should apply for the associate pastor position. Well, it was 4 weeks later. It happened to be the men's retreat weekend. And in my company, the fourth quarter was the busiest. So I couldn't go to the retreat. And the senior pastor had decided that he was going to go that weekend, and the rest of the elders happened to sign up as well. But there was one individual who actually now is on our staff. He was a school teacher. He had felt the call to go in the ministry, and he was already in seminary. And he'd been pleading with the pastor to preach on a Sunday. So he had told this individual, "Okay, I'm going to the retreat. You can preach this Sunday." Well, that Sunday morning, I get a call from him. And he says, "Bruce, I have the flu and I can't preach. And you're the only elder left. You got to come to church and preach today." And I said, "There's no way. It's 7:00. The next service, the first service is 8:00. I said, "Look, I'll meet you there. I'll be there by 7:30. I'll do all the announcements. I'll do the offering. All you have to do is get up and give your sermon and then go back to the pastor's office and rest till the next service." So I arrive at 7:30. He's got his tie on. He's got the microphone on. I said, "Okay, you ready to go? We're going to do this." I said, I got it covered for you." And he said, "I'm going home." I said, "What do you mean you're going home?" He said, "I literally just threw up. I can't preach." He goes, "You're going to have to do it." And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And I started having a panic attack. And then I remembered that I had the notes from my dad's service still in my Bible. And I'd preached on the parable of the sower. My dad was an evangelist and he loved flowers. And so I'd used this prop of some flowers that he had planted. And we actually put seeds in baggies and passed them out to the whole congregation. And so I had these notes on the parable of the sower. And so I made a couple of changes and put in a couple of illustrations and got up and explained to them, the congregation, the first service, what had happened. And by the end of the second service, there were 3 services. By the end of the second, I had 6 people come up to me and say, "If that associate pastor position ever comes up, you really should apply." And that was actually more horrifying to me than having to preach for the first time without any notice or any practice. And so I did. I ended up applying for the position. I waited till the last day, and I was pretty certain that I wasn't going to get it. So I went out and I bought a brand new computer, a new Mac, the fastest. It was called the Power Mac. And I finished my logo, and I printed 3,000 letterhead and business cards and stationery because I was going to start my own company. I decided that it wasn't working out. The company I was running, the owner had promised ownership or at least partnership, and it did not come to fruition. And I decided I'm just going to start on my own.
At that time, did you want to do that, start your own company more than be an associate pastor?
Absolutely. Well, there are a few layers to it. One, growing up in a church, I'd seen the kind of hurt that took place, especially in a small church. And I also saw in a small church the financial struggle that it was. So our family, relatively speaking, was pretty poor. And just one example, my parents didn't have money for college for me. So my first year, I went to UC Davis, and they sold one of their vehicles so I could go to school. And I had purchased a car and fixed it up. And in order for the second year, fall semester, I sold my car. Well, then I ran out of money. And by the end of my sophomore year, there wasn't anything left. So I had to drop out of school, work construction for 2 years. When I went back, I had to work full-time at night. And it was a strain to get through college. But really, I would say the most significant contributing factor was the challenges and the hurt and the injury that came from being a pastor and the strain on a family. My brother had gone off the rails. He was doing drugs at 14 years of age, and it just seemed to be devastating. And everybody I knew that was a pastor's kid, there were issues. And I didn't want that for my family. But I also loved art, and I was good at it. I made a good living, and I got lots of accolades, and I had this vision of having a Christian-run organization. I had this whole idea of how I was going to build this company that was going to be in the marketplace, and my idea was, like Paul, I was going to be the tent maker, and I would serve the Lord, and I would be a leader in the church, but I would use my company as a platform to share the gospel in the community and with clients. And it had already been, even though I didn't own the company, I had multiple opportunities to share the gospel with clients and things that would happen that provided me an opportunity to be a light to them. So those are the main reasons why I didn't want to be a pastor. And I was really just falling through because I was trying to be obedient to the Lord. And honestly, and the reason I shared the point about the stationery and the computer was I felt like this was kind of my Isaac. I was going to put the Isaac, my dream to to own my company and run it, on the altar. And God would see, because I was following through, I was ready to put the knife to my dream, that he was going to give me permission to do it. And what was so astonishing to me is that through the interviewing process, which from the day that I put the application in to when they actually offered me a position was 9 months. And through the 9-month process, between what was happening at work, running the company, what was happening in my home and in my heart and in the church, it really became clear to me that God had called me to do this. And I started getting excited about it. And the position was really tailored for me. It was, as an associate, I was not supposed to preach only twice a year when the senior pastor was gone, but I was supposed to be an administrator, help the church get organized, to lead discipleship groups, and to organize Sunday school and discipleship ministries. And that was one of the things that I was comfortable with. I ran a company, and so I knew how to organize and how to lead, and I knew about promoting, and I thought this would be a perfect fit for me. So by the time they offered me the position, I was dialed in. But the challenge was, because I'd been running this company, that it left the few employees in a precarious position. So I went to the owner and I told him, I said, I'm going to give my notice and I'm actually going to be leaving. And he said, well, I am not surprised. I knew with your gifts and your talents that you would get picked up. He goes, what company are you going to? Are you going to a big ad agency? I said, I'm actually leaving the industry and I'm becoming a pastor at my church. And he said, what? Now, mind you, I'd worked for him for 14 years, shared the gospel with him countless times. One time I told him, hey, I'm going through this class where I have to learn to share about my faith, and I need to practice. Can I do that with you? And he's like, yeah, okay. Well, in the middle of my testimony, he literally got up and left the room. He just didn't want anything to do with it. now I'm actually leaving this company to become a pastor. And he's completely shocked and astonished by it. And so now he has all these questions about, well, why would you do that? What's causing this? And he's become open to the gospel. What we ultimately decided is that I would give him a 6-week notice, but then I would run his company for 6 months while I was at the church, helping him to find a replacement for me. And he was amicable to that idea. And about 3 weeks into that 6 weeks, he said, I'm going to take my family away for 2 weeks, and then I'll come back. We'll spend the last week before you make your transition and button everything up. And in the first week, they were going to Monterey. In the first week that he was gone, I get a call from his wife about 10, maybe 11 o'clock in the morning. It's a Thursday, I still remember. And she's hysterical. She's crying. And I said, what's wrong? What's wrong? And she said, Steve had a brain aneurysm and he's in a coma. And evidently he'd gotten in the shower. He was only 48 years of age. And the aneurysm happened and the door was locked. And so they heard the water continue to run, and they couldn't get in to find out. And they had to call the paramedics and break the door down. So his brain was bleeding for an hour and a half before they could get him into surgery. And needless to say, all of a sudden, this neat plan of transition became completely hectic and chaotic. And what began to transpire after that was completely unexpected. He had assigned a business manager should something happen, a living trust. And the business manager was then to figure out a way to negotiate the business to help his family. He had 2 young children. I believe their ages were 8 and 4 at the time. And so the business manager, of course, came to me because I've been running the company and I'd built the clientele. And he started out negotiating. He says, he's not going to get better. And even if he doesn't pass away, he's not going to be able to run this company if you leave. So he said, we'll offer you a 25% raise of what you're making right now. And I said, well, yeah, I appreciate it, but I'm not going to do that. 3 days later, he came back and he said, we'll give you a 50% raise. I said, no, I'm sorry. I'm just not compelled to accept that offer. I feel really bad, but I've told the church I'm taking this job. 3 days later, he comes back and he says, look, everybody knows that you run this company, that you built the clientele. I've spoken with the owner's wife and she's willing to give you the company and we'll work out the payment plan and you can pay her a certain part of the proceeds over the course of time. Well, I knew because I took care of the bids and the invoicing. I knew how much the company was worth. And I knew what that represented was a six-figure salary for me, along with complete ownership and complete authority to have my vision, to run my vision and play that out. And it was a very unexpected narrative because if you would have told that to me even 12 months earlier before my dad had passed away, I would have said that, though I'm heartbroken about the owner, this is a dream come true. And yet, without blinking an eye, I told him I can't accept that offer. His response was, how much are they paying you at that church? What are they offering you? What's the bottom line? And I said, well, the reality is I'm taking a 25% cut in pay of what I currently make to take that. And he goes, why would you do that? I said, because I've come to a place in my life where I know God has called me to do that. And to not accept that calling would be one of the most foolish decisions I've ever made.
It's really interesting, the timing of that opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
That was after you got the pastor job?
Yeah, hadn't started, but the position had been offered, yes.
And you accepted?
And I'd agreed.
And so how long after that did this all happen?
It was literally within 4 weeks of when I had said yes to take the position, when this business manager was now offering me the ownership of the company.
Wow.
So about 2 weeks out from when I was supposed to start, what ended up transpiring is that I did agree to run the company for 8 months and help to find a buyer to take the company, which was a lot more challenging than I thought because I had already agreed to work 40 hours a week at the church. So it ended up being pretty consistently a 70-hour work week for another 7 or 8 months, but
Wow.
eventually helped them to find a buyer and sold the company.
Did the owner ever recover?
Miraculously, he did not pass away, but had permanent brain damage. So he learned to walk and talk. It was in the front lobe of his brain, so where critical thinking, emotions, it was strange where he would just at times start laughing at nothing, or he would start crying. And I went to see him, I would say the first 2 years when I became a pastor. He came out of the coma in about 3 months, went into Casa Colina, and I started visiting him at Casa Colina. Throughout that period, I would go and visit him at least once a month. And then probably for the first year and a half, maybe almost 2 years, would see him pretty frequently. And then as the ministry increased and it came to the point where they were wanting me to become the senior pastor, it got harder and harder. And tragically lost track of he and his family. They moved at some point of the transition. That's probably the one sorrow, is that I really wish that he had come to faith in Christ. And maybe he did, but I never had the privilege to actually see that transpire.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing, that phenomenon of making a decision and then having to make it again because another opportunity comes up. I had a friend not too long ago who lost his job, and for a while, a lot of people around him were telling him, I think you should start your own business. So it's kind of the opposite of yours, where that was kind of what he was feeling called to do. Mm-hmm. He told me he would not do that because, well, he's going to quit his job, he's got a family, all this kind of stuff. He went up in the mountains for a day or two. He was praying about it. And he made his decision, I'm going to pursue this. Mm-hmm. And so he comes down. He had already applied to some jobs. He got a job that would have paid at least as good, but it was definitely better than his old job. It was what he was looking for. And so he had to make that decision again and say no. Mm-hmm. That's really painful. He's like, why did I have to get offered that? It would have been so much easier if I didn't get offered that. But I mean, I think definitely through your experience, you would believe that God often tests our path.
Yes.
And from what you've said, he's tested your path more than once in the sense of, thinking about stepping back from different things in the church or even stepping away and possibly retiring and stuff like that. So when you counsel people, because there's so many parts of that story, there's friction with your wife, your own father telling you, I don't think this is right. Are there any things that you typically go to when asking somebody to examine if it's God or not?
Yeah. So the year before my dad passed away, before all of those things took place, my senior pastor had taken me out to breakfast. And I'd been on his elder board at that time for 4 years. And he'd seen me teach Sunday school. I'd actually spoke at a Sunday evening service. And he said, God has given you gifts, and I really think you need to be honest with yourself about that. What he didn't know is simultaneously, my dad had been saying the same things. He had heard me speak at a men's retreat, and he'd been saying, God's given you gifts, and you need to be listening and adhering to the calling that I think he has. Well, my response to my senior pastor that morning at breakfast was, I said, well, maybe if this whole thing in my career blows up and I get fired or the industry goes under, then I'll think about that. And I'll never forget his response to that. He says, God won't do that. God will call you at the top of your career because he wants you to choose him, not as a last resort, but as first. So when the business manager offered me the ownership of the company, and I had to make the decision over my dream and what I'd been working for many years or my calling, it was as if what that senior pastor had said was prophetic. It was almost scripted exactly as he described. And I knew that I was choosing God over my dreams and my visions, which was a interesting part of that 9 months that I described, because there were a number of things that God did to begin to shift my heart, and I think ties into your question. And one of the things, as I was thinking about the stationery that I had printed and this computer that I purchased and starting a business plan, I felt like God was saying, so what I'm asking you to do is to join me in my vision. Your vision is only going to be as big as your ideas and your abilities, but my vision is eternal. And I'm asking you to join something that's going to last way beyond your lifetime and be exponential. And that was an intriguing idea to say, wow, really what my dream is so temporal and superficial. And the other part of it was coming back to the idea of calling, is that as I'd shared what was happening in my home and how that was defining certain decisions, and then my dad's illness and hearing his stories, family was really becoming a catalyst for many of my decisions. That value was beginning to change perspectives. It's one of the reasons why I was so disdaining the idea that on the day I'm burying my dad, I got to do this packaging layout, where that had been one of those dreams, is to be designing package that you would actually see in stores and there'd be entire displays. And so in the aspect of calling, God basically was proposing is that you've been at this church, this is your church family. They're constantly wanting to get together, get people in your Sunday school class. They want to ask you opinions about marriage and about the Bible, but you don't have time because you're running a company. I'm giving you a chance to actually minister and serve to your family every week. And when I started thinking about those two offers that came with this calling, they were very appealing. So I share some of the backstory because, going back to your question, I think that many people are unaware of a calling. And I think that those that may have heard that term or have an idea have an inadequate view of that. And my argument would be, going back to your illustration of your friend, is that if we're following Christ, every person has a calling. We always associate or assume that a calling is some sort of vocational endeavor, vocational ministry. But I would disagree with that, because I look at examples in Scripture where God has given a calling and a mission to each individual, but each of it has to do with their unique giftedness and their unique region or era that they're serving in. I think about Esther as an example. When you hear the story of Esther, who has now been brought into this foreign kingdom, has now been brought into the king's palace and has become the queen, and when her people are about to be annihilated through a malicious scheme, her uncle comes and says, "You have been called for such a time as this." Well, she wasn't a pastor. She wasn't in vocational ministry, but she was called to do something for the Lord and for his kingdom and his people. And I think that's one of those aspects of a calling that's transcendent, and I think applies to your friend, is that God called him to leave that. And having heard his story before, my sense is, especially as that's gaining momentum, that it's actually going to build some freedom and flexibility into his life and his schedule to use his spiritual gifts more readily in some other areas, that if he was working for a company, especially the one offer that he got, that he then had to say no to again, would have prohibited that flexibility and the vision that I think that God's building in his heart related to the church, to ministry, to his wife, family, so on and so forth.
Yeah. You know, it does seem like a lot of the times it is more often associated with specific ministry things, especially pastors. I remember growing up, my grandfather would tell me, you would never be a pastor unless you're called.
Mm-hmm.
And almost every pastor that I've come across, that I've known personally, has had that experience. But I think it's unique also because not all types of work are you sought after because of maturity or because of certain gifting, right? A lot of work that people do is just for money. It's not for any greater purpose. I think it gets more difficult to nail down what you're supposed to be doing when it's not as obvious what great purpose this serves. I don't know. I think that's a struggle for a lot of people, especially in our young adults group, as you're aware. You know, a lot of people have good jobs, but I'm not sure they see how it really connects to a greater purpose.
Let me respond to that insight related to vocational ministry and pastors. So in my nearly 27 years as a pastor, I've interviewed countless people, hired numerous ones. And I would say one of the things that was disappointing to me in the last maybe 15 years, how many people, and many of them coming out of Bible school or even seminary, were approaching the position that was being posted as a job, not as a calling. First interview, they're negotiating salary. They're inquiring about benefit packages. And I'm thinking to myself, when I went into graphic design, I didn't even do that. I'm just happy to have a job. And yet they're not even being offered the job, and they're already negotiating, leveraging what they're going to get out of it. And when that began to happen, when I started seeing that trend, I began to realize that if they were hired, their life in ministry was going to be a significant struggle, because it's a call to servanthood. And as a servant, it means there's sacrifice. It means you're going to work holidays, and you're going to get calls in the middle of the night, and you're going to have challenging situations. And if you're doing it anything for any other reason other than for God and a calling, you're not going to last. You'll be so hurt and frustrated that you'll quit. Now, with that being said, how could I say that God calls believers to different professions? Well, I think the same thing. I have friends right now who thought that the career of teaching, being a teacher, would be a wonderful opportunity. But they were looking at it purely from a career path. Get summers off. I've got a week at Christmas, a week at spring break. This will be wonderful. Then they get into it, and they're realizing that every night they're grading papers till 8 or 9 o'clock at night. And they're dealing with upset parents and unruly children, and administrators are not supportive. And we've watched it. You and I both have friends who have left the profession of teaching through COVID because it was just too hard. But the ones that have stuck with it were ones that really felt called to that they had a purpose. I'll use the term that you use. They clearly understood what their purpose as a believer was, and how the profession of teaching was the vehicle that provided the means to fulfill their purpose. In most of their cases, they felt called to fulfill that purpose to children, to students who are at a place that are very formative. And I remember talking to a friend who was a middle school teacher, and I said, wow, that's a unique calling. You could have taught 12 different grades, and yet you chose 6th, 7th, and 8th. Why? And their response was, because it's such a formative stage. They haven't reached the older teen years in high school, or they're more cynical, but they're old enough to where they're starting to understand abstracts, and they're forming ideas and concepts. And I saw this as the most advantageous place to help them to define godly values, to be able to speak into their lives. So middle school was the most appropriate place to fulfill my calling.
So could you say from that people shouldn't be thinking about how to make money as a primary factor with their jobs? How would you communicate that? Because it sounds like, when I say it, it sounds obvious, but I don't think most people live that way. I don't think most people choose a job because of fulfilling a greater purpose.
Well, that question really affords a lot of considerations. I do think that is the case. I think the majority of people, believers and not, choose a profession based upon its monetary value. What are they going to gain through that? And maybe even if they say, well, money's not the most important thing to me, it is the time, or it's the additional benefits, or it's the freedom that it provides. But somehow or another, they're looking at it as a return on investment.
Right.
I've spent money on an education. I'm going to devote myself to this organization or this company. What am I going to get in return? And I've watched over and over, and I have been one that's been guilty of that. In my early years, my journey through college and my drive was to get through college so that I could get into the workforce and make a lot of money. Not that I wanted to be rich. I just was tired of being poor. And so I took my spring semester, 25 units, to finish and walk so I could go on and get a master's in architecture and get a really great job.
Yeah.
And the irony to that is that I had my plan, but I was trusting God was going to rubber stamp my plan, and God slammed every door closed. My senior year ended in a recession where there was no work, and especially in the housing industry. And they only had 35 positions at Cal Poly's master program. And all the current senior graduates were filling that up. They had 500 applicants for 35 positions.
Wow.
I couldn't get in to save my life. And I ended up going to work at the school as a gardener because I had to have a job. And God just continued to inform me that I need to get on board with his plan. So even the season in graphic design, God had a specific purpose in that. And there were many things he was doing and preparing me. But I would say halfway through those 14 years, what you and I are talking about, God began to make apparent to me. The difficulty is that I didn't have language for it. And there weren't individuals that were mentoring me and explaining to me what was going. But I'll give you an example of what I mean and come back to my point. So there was this restlessness in my heart. It was probably about 4 years into that career. And I immediately assumed, well, God had called me, I thought, maybe earlier in my life to be a pastor. I said no. And so I had a friend who was a missionary in Ecuador, and he'd been begging me to go down. And so I thought, well, I'm going to go to Ecuador because if God's calling me, clearly he's going to send me to the jungles of the Amazon, and I'll be living out in the bush. So let's just get it over with. So I traveled to Ecuador. I spent 10 days down there. We traveled all over the Andes, went down in the Amazon. I came back, and I was single at the time. My roommate said, so are you moving to Ecuador? Are you going to become a missionary? And I said, no, I actually feel at peace with where I'm at and called to do what I'm doing. That I have a platform to share the gospel in my company, and I'm sharing with my boss, my owner, and I'm serving in my church. I'm completely at peace with where I'm at. And I felt that way, as I'd already shared the story, all the way up to where I was going to start my company. I was going to do that. It just so happened that God was changing the direction for me. But I really do think that restlessness of within about 4 to 5 years of the 14-year journey was God changing my heart, my perspective about, it's not about a paycheck. And a couple other components that affirmed that was, it wasn't long after that where I hit a dry spell and I didn't have any creativity whatsoever. And I started having a panic attack. I'm thinking, I'm 5 years into this career and I can't come up with a creative idea to save my life. And I had to commute from where I lived. Our studio was in Monrovia, and I commuted from West Covina. So the route was through Irwindale, through the rock quarries. It was the most dismal drive you could ever imagine. And I'm looking at all these rocks, and I remember thinking very clearly, I can recall I was on Arrow Highway, and I thought to myself, no wonder I don't have any creative ideas. Look at the environment that I'm supposed to work in and drive through. And immediately the Spirit gave this epiphany and said, well, isn't it interesting that you know the creator of the universe, but you never bother to ask your creator of how to be creative? And that was probably one of the most significant things that all of a sudden I began to realize that God had given me a creative ability, an artistic ability, and he'd actually given me a job to facilitate it, but I never invited him into it. And so from that point, I started praying. And honestly, the best design work I did began to happen after that. And
That's fascinating.
It became another platform for testimonies.
Yeah.
When people were like, man, I love this. I love what you did. How did you come up with it? I said, well, actually, I just spent some time praying and I asked God, and all of a sudden I started thinking about this and I started thinking about your product, and here's what came to fruition.
That's interesting because the first thing that came to my mind, Abel Berg. So one thing, he'll appreciate a shout out. One thing that I was realizing recently, I've had this drum set in my house for a few years, and I haven't really used it as much as I thought I would, and it was expensive. And so I was like, okay, God, I prayed about it. I was like, if you want me to get rid of it, I want somebody to pick it up within 24 hours. Otherwise,
Nice.
I'm going to keep it for a while. Maybe you have a purpose for it. Well, somebody ended up picking it up within 24 hours of me posting it. The reason I bring that up is because that was an area of my life. I've always bought and sold things on my own, on Craigslist, all this other stuff. And it's something I feel comfortable with. So it's not something I pray about. If they want it, they want it. If not, they don't. But Abel was one of the first people, he buys and sells cars. And so I remember one time we were going out to Burbank. He was getting a Hummer. And he's like, let's pray. And so he started praying over God, if you would show me favor in this deal, that it would work out. I asked that you would do that. And I'm just like, you're praying for a car? You're praying for buying something online. But I was like, but it was profound in the sense that he's inviting God into an area that most of us never think to invite God into. Mm-hmm. We think of, oh, well, he'll help me with a Bible study. He'll help me witness to somebody. But, I'm going out to make this deal, and I feel, if anyone should feel comfortable buying and selling cars, he would. But I thought that was interesting that he prayed over it. So that was just something that really stuck with me when you brought up the praying over creativity, because I started to do that with songwriting, and I've noticed a big difference. Inviting God into every area of life, especially the areas that we think we're strong in.
Excellent. And that's a perfect segue to that second thought that I had, which is, as that began to transpire in my life, I came back to what we've all been told is the chief end of man is the glory of God.
Yeah.
And yet I'd made my career the chief end my paycheck or the awards or the clients.
Yeah.
And when it began to occur to me that this gift God had given me actually was for his glory, which was kind of an abstract idea initially. But I also began to realize that part of us living for the glory of God brings us joy. And what once had been very stressful and uncertain when it came to my design work started becoming a joy, because it wasn't just the final outcome. It was the entire process. It was the prayer that went in, the thoughtfulness, the brainstorming, the production of it. And that's why I think it was a bit of a shock to me when God didn't give me my dream to run the company, because by this time I've been living out that process for at least 7 or 8 years, and it made a lot of sense to me. Hence, if I had my own company, it would become even more clear to others. But I really think that part of why God allowed that for that extended period was to see that that's a transcendent reality for the believer, no matter what their calling might be. So if each person, rather than looking at a profession purely as an aspect of a paycheck or its fringe benefits, said, how has God gifted me in this area, and what in this particular profession am I lacking? Because guaranteed there's something. You may be good to a certain point in your own strength and giftedness, but by the sovereign design of God, he intentionally leaves certain aspects that leave an inadequacy, which require you to call upon him and be dependent upon him.
Right.
And I didn't really understand that in the moment, but in hindsight, I began to realize that there were certain aspects, like the business part. When I started doing marketing and running part of the business, I didn't have any background in that. And that became even more of a motivator for me to call upon God. And then we transitioned from traditional doing artwork on boards and drawing by hand to computers. And that's really when I started running the company, because the owner wanted nothing to do with that. But by the time 2 years had gone by, everything was digital. film was digital,
Yeah.
drawings were digital, everything was electronic, and it was stressful. It was all new to everybody. Things weren't working right, and the hardware, the software. But that was all part of God's plan. And when I became a pastor, that reality became even more apparent because every day I was in over my head. And the fascinating thing to me, in nearly 3 decades now of leading in ministry, there's not a single day where I go into it and think, I got this.
Mm.
When I was in design, within 7 years, I knew everything about the industry. I would, before that epiphany, I would walk into a boardroom and knew that I was going to have it nailed in my presentation. I sized up the people in the room. I knew what they wanted, and I'd do my presentation and take home the project. But every day being called to the ministry, I never know what's going to happen. I never know what's going to take place. I may think there's a meeting that's just a casual get together, and 40 minutes into it, the person drops a bomb, and it's like, this is what's going on. I'm leaving my wife, or I'm having an affair, or there's some crazy thing that gets communicated, and you're completely caught off guard. Yet, whether it's a vocational ministry you're in, or it's a professional songwriter, or it's running the department in the grocery store, the fact of the matter is that God has put us in places that require us to be dependent upon him to truly be effective for his honor and his glory. And the sooner we discover that, the greater peace and the more effectiveness we're going to have in whatever profession God has placed us in.
I have a question for you. Do you think the process of manhood and womanhood has been delayed at all in the last couple generations?
I think the process of maturity has been delayed. And realize, of the different things that I've been saying that have a subjective tone to it, this would be the one with the greatest subjectivity to it. I would form my opinion on the shift between baby boomers and ultimately reaching the millennial generation. So those of us that are boomers were raised by what has been called the greatest generation. And the greatest generation was those folks that survived World War II and led to this booming economy of the 50s in America. And though as a generation, they did a lot, they accomplished a lot in industry and communication, as far as society goes, apart from the necessity of spirituality, great progress. Put a man on the moon. But they lacked in many ways certain skills and gifts, and much of it related to spirituality. So parenting, as an example, in my upbringing, never had a clear conversation about sex. It was taboo. You just didn't talk about it. And yet my generation was struggling. We were on the backside of the sexual revolution of the late 60s, and it was in our face. And yet my parents' generation would not talk about it. They wouldn't talk about money. Money was a private thing. And so both of those areas were steep learning curves for me. I got myself deep into debt, struggled with aspects of lust in my teen years, nobody to go to help to understand and figure out, how do we live in this predicament in a godly and pure way? So there are more examples I could give to you of the propensity that generation had when it came to these types of areas, especially areas that deal with our spiritual formation. So my generation, like many generations do, swung the pendulum to the opposite side, where kids were, in my parents' generation, kids were to be seen and not heard. My generation put our children in the center of it.
Mm-hmm.
And Monica and I immediately did that and found out the hard way. And our son, by the time he reached 18 months to 2 years, had already had full stride in the terrible twos, was throwing temper tantrums to the point where we couldn't leave him even with grandparents. Nobody wanted to watch him. And by the time he was 2.5, 3, everybody was sharing their opinions about what we're to do to get this kid in line. And I can recall one time where a dear friend who was a marriage and family therapist said, well, he throws temper tantrums because you give attention. So you need to lock him in his room. Well, I said, we don't have a lock on his bedroom door. Well, then hold the door. So he started throwing a temper tantrum, and we put him in his room, and he's pounding on the door, and Monica are holding the door, and I'm feeling absolutely terrible. And I'm thinking, what is he doing? What's happening? And suddenly he got quiet, and that got concerning. And all of a sudden, I heard this terrible crash. So we immediately swing the door open. Well, he had a 6-foot bookcase that had a wire frame. So you could actually, on the ends where the shelves would set, you could crawl up like a ladder. He had crawled up to the top shelf using the frame as a ladder and had systematically cleared probably 70 books off of each shelf and was sitting in a pile about 2 feet deep. And that became the turning point. We said, we got to get help because everybody's opinion is not working. Well, I share that story because it boiled down to one insightful friend who had some kids a little bit older and asked a question, said, when you come home from work, Bruce, what do you do? I said, well, I play with my son. I give him attention. And they said, do you spend time with his mom? Well, yeah, after he goes to bed. They said, well, what you're experiencing is insecurity. Insecurity results in bad behavior. And you and his mom represent his source of security at the age of 3. Then they said, does he come crawl in bed with you at night? It's like every night we can't get any sleep. Well, that's because that's the one place that he sees you together. So he wants to come in and play with the two of you together. So their counsel was, when you come home, it's going to be rough the first couple of weeks, but you tell him that you're going to spend time with his mommy and that he's not to interrupt. He can sit in the room, but he's not to get in between you. And I'm like, what will that do? But I thought, I'm willing to try anything. And so we started doing that. And my friend was right. The first week was a living nightmare. But pretty soon he began to get it. And I began to become convinced that we had made our son the center of the universe. And at the age of 3, emotionally, he couldn't cope with that. We took all the boundaries away. We got rid of the crib. We got him a big boy's bed. And though we had college degrees, we didn't really understand even the human development aspect that children need boundaries and structure for security, and security represents behavior.
Yeah.
And so coming back to your original question, it is my opinion that that was not unique to Monica and I. That represented our generation. And we made our children the center of the universe, of our lives. And they defined what they were going to do and what they were going to pursue. And now you see it in the next generation where my friends who are in education, that the parents are coming in and they're defining how much homework their child's going to have and what's actually fair and what grades they should have. And these are some of the reasons why they're ready to leave the profession, because they don't get support from their parents. The parents feel like their child deserves and has an entitlement for whatever. And so when I think about how some missing components of a child's development has been removed, it sabotages on the worst side, but at the very least, it suppresses the natural divine development of their lives of growing to maturity.
Yeah.
So they're oftentimes overwhelmed because their freedoms are immense, and they never learn to actually grow to be critical thinkers, to make right decisions. And so they tend to be, I would say, suppressed or retarded from a natural development by the time they reach their early 20s.
Speaking of which, it seems like college is like the new high school, and then the 20s are the new early 20s. Now it's like if you're in your 30s and unmarried, it's not that weird anymore, I don't feel like. Maybe we're just in California. Maybe that's what it is. I remember you talking about a period in your life which would fall into the period of being a young adult. And it wasn't, from what it sounds like, it wasn't a super enjoyable time, but it was a very formative time.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
how is that important for you before you met Monica, before you
Mm-hmm.
got involved in Cornerstone in the way that
Mm-hmm.
you did? Because to be an elder at 32 is pretty young,
Mm-hmm.
but they must have seen something in you.
That's a really interesting question, and it does require a little bit of backstory. So, as I describe my subjective view from my parents' generation to mine, the one caveat in my home was that my mom was much more like my generation.
Hmm.
And my mom wanted to make life easy for me. My dad was raised on a farm. His father was basically that European group that came over and began to work the land. And my dad was a hard worker, never played sports, saw no benefit in sports. And so there was tension in my parents' marriage over me. My dad wanted me to grow up. He wanted to teach me how to change the oil in my car and how to use tools and be responsible. And my mom's like, oh, he doesn't need to do that. And so I would say because we tend to lean towards what's easy and comfortable, I, for all intents and purposes, was a mama's boy to the point where my mom actually filled out my college application and got me into college. That's how bad it was.
Hmm.
But the epiphany came my freshman year when I began to realize that I was unique and that everybody else had grown up. And emotionally, I was significantly immature compared to the other student body at UC Davis.
In what ways?
I'll give you an example. The first week of school, my mom had picked all my classes and had drawn a map of where I was to go. And I had an English class and I got there and they had changed the class. I go in and I sit down and I realize in the first 15 minutes, this isn't an English class. So I muster up the courage to say, am I in the right class? And they said, oh no, didn't you read the note that came? Your section's been changed. Well, because I missed the first class, they dropped me. And it was stuff like that that continued happening. And then other co-eds found out about that. And they're like, what? Your mom wrote your application and got you into this college? What? That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And I actually started feeling really ashamed. And it was at that point that I began to realize where I felt like my dad was too hard on me. He was just trying to counter my mom and help me to grow up. And that really began to perpetuate things for me because now I had a really steep learning curve. And so when, as I mentioned, I ran out of money for college and had to go to work in construction, my boss was a former Marine drill sergeant in Vietnam. And you talk about hard. I literally would yell in my face. And so that became your question about formative, that became a very formative place for me emotionally because he wouldn't put up with anything. And I had to have a job. I had to put food on the table. And so for 2 years, I went through a living nightmare working for this guy. But I began to develop skills and I began to develop a confidence and I began to see emotionally that I needed to be an adult. But tragically, my spiritual life was not keeping in step with my emotional and physical development. And that's where that part that you referred to began to happen. And basically, God put me in a trial of 5 years. And I metaphorically call it his classroom of divine curriculum. And part of that was I didn't date for those 5 years. And
Was that on purpose or it happened that way?
there were contributing factors to it, yeah. But mostly because God made it crystal clear. And at times when I think about it, he would bring me back to the reality of my circumstances. And so girls and dating had been a major distraction in my life. And if I'm being transparent, didn't know it at the time, but in hindsight realized that they really were an idol. That part of my emotional immaturity was that I felt better when I had a girlfriend. Felt like I was loved and valued and accepted. And so I constantly, they wouldn't last very long, 2 or 3 months. And before you know it, I was in another relationship.
Yeah.
And never connecting the dots about how anemic I really was and how dysfunctional these relationships were. But that 5-year hiatus was an incredible opportunity to learn about what healthy relationships were. I even started reading books on marriage. I read one book that still is a go-to is called Marriage Builders by Larry Crabb, and
I have that one
it's
actually.
great. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I remember reading it, and part of me is like, well, what's the point? I'm not, there's nobody on the horizon, but then all of a sudden, I'm like, wow, these three loves, eros, phileo, and agape, all work together. It's part of God's design. And started realizing in these relationships in the past that there were major components that were missing, and there was legitimate reasons why they were so unhealthy. And I began to determine that I was going to let God work in my life emotionally, spiritually, and relationally, so that I could be a healthy contributor to someday. I was hoping for a marriage.
Yeah. Mm. And during that time, what was happening spiritually that changed?
That's a profound question, and there's some significant parts to it. The first thing I would say is that the denomination that I grew up in, my dad's denomination, taught that you could lose your salvation. And so they didn't believe in eternal security. And so it was heavy on works. And subsequently, there was an absence of grace. And so, literally to the age of 25, I would have nightmares that the rapture would happen and I would be sent to hell.
Mm.
And so, even though I was in church and I had prayed the prayer and I had all those things, I never had an assurance of salvation. And I never felt like I was doing enough good things. And subsequently, because there was so much focus on the outside, I never really addressed the issues of my heart. So I was full of anger and rage and lust. And so the first place that God began to address that, as that transition began to happen in that year when I turned 25, was he began to remove some of the blinders. And I found myself in Matthew. I tried to be disciplined. My dad really enforced having a quiet time, but it was just a ritual for me. I'd check it off the box, wouldn't remember what I read. But because I was in a desperate situation and suffered a significant loss, I started reading more diligently, and I decided I'd go to the New Testament. So, of course, you start with the book of Matthew. And I remember walking through the Sermon on the Mount, and I'm like, wow, I'm sure I'd heard of it, never really understood it.
Mm.
And I think one of the contributing factors is that in my dad's denomination, and he was a part of that, is that they were prone to allegory. So we never had exegetical teaching, never walked through the book of Matthew. And so here I am reading Sermon on the Mount, and I get to chapters 6 and 7, and Jesus says, you've heard it said that thou shalt not commit murder, but I say to you, if you have anger in your heart and you say to your brother, Raka, you are in danger of the fires of hell. You've heard it say, thou shalt not commit adultery. But if you have lust in your heart, you've already committed adultery with a woman. And I'm thinking, wow, I'm in big trouble. I've consoled myself by saying I've never done those things, yet in my heart, I'm constantly angry and I'm continually frustrated and upset at people and saying things that are insensitive and even rude. And so I got to chapter 7, and there's a section where Jesus says, you come to me and you say, Lord, Lord, we healed the sick and we preached the good news and we cast out demons. And he says, away from you, doers of iniquity, I never knew you. And honestly, it was at that point I began to weep, and I began to think, I don't think he knows me and I don't know him. And though I never heard an audible voice, I felt like the Spirit saying, you've judged me. You've tried to frame me into your own idea of what a God should be. And you've blamed me for all the problems that you've had, and you don't even know me. You've framed blessing as material blessings. You went to college and you should have this great job and make all this kind of money. And you went on your own and took on a bunch of debt so you can have a new car, new furniture, never inquiring of me what I think. And now you can't make the payments and it's my fault. And I felt like God was impressing upon me, find in my word where I ever said that blessing was a nice car or a big house. And all of a sudden, as I continue reading in Matthew, I started hearing Jesus say in Matthew chapter 10, I'm sending you out as sheep among wolves, that if they hated me, they're going to hate you. If they persecute me, they're going to persecute you. And all of a sudden I realized, wow, this whole idea of being a Christian is nothing what I really thought it was. It's about a life of sacrifice. It's about a life of service. It's a life about Christ, not about me. And I would say that that was a place where traction really began to happen. If I were to share just one other area that was most formative, is that I can't remember where I went from Matthew or what the transition was, but somehow within less than a year, maybe a year and a half, I ended up in Romans. And I remember, I could actually remember where I was at in my apartment when I got to Romans chapter 7. And I started reading the testimony of Paul. So another struggle of my theological upbringing was not only was it taught that you could lose your salvation, but they also had this doctrine called the second work of grace. Now that denomination, they've said, oh, that we don't believe that, and they've kind of diminished or done away with it. But the second work of grace meant that you could pray, and by God's grace, he would sanctify you and never sin again. And my dad and I had numerous arguments, debates about that. I'd say, how could you say that? You sin all the time. And he said, well, what it's talking about is what you do intentionally, and it's a pattern. But, these things, when I get angry, I lose my temper, it's just coincidental. Yeah. I'm like, that's not biblical. I don't see any place. Even though I'm not a theologian, I don't see that any place. Well, I get to Romans chapter 7, and Paul starts explaining the law and how the law is there to show us God's standard that we need is grace. And if God had not said that coveting is wrong, I would have not known that coveting my neighbor's possessions was wrong. So I come to this realization that the law is good, that the law shows me what's expected. So in my mind, I'm in agreement with the law, but in my flesh, I can't do it. For what I want to do, I don't do.
Right.
And of course, he comes into the chapter and he says, what a wretch I am, who will save me from this body of death? And I kept reading and I got to Romans 8:1. Therefore, there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And I literally began to weep, and I began to realize that for 25 years, this had been my struggle. Maybe not completely 25, but prayed at 7. From the age of 7 to now I'm 26 at this point of my spiritual journey. The things I've shared, I battled with, and I struggled with guilt and condemnation and fear and anxiety. And I began to realize that that's not what Christ offered me. That Christ offered me forgiveness and salvation and grace. And when I kept reading in the days ahead, and I finished chapter 8 with nothing will separate you from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus, that literally changed my life. That chapter and that succinct period became a trajectory that has never changed. It really, if I were to say, going back to the earlier conversation about calling, it was that spiritual experience, that divine revelation in Scripture that continued to point me forward with a longing and a zeal to not go back. In the past, spiritually speaking, it'd be one step forward and 2 steps back. It was constantly a discouragement. And I'm not saying it hasn't been perfect and that the trajectory has always been the same slope and progression, but every day after whatever it's been, 37 years almost, I have never looked back. I long to keep going forward with Christ. In fact, I would say in the current state, God's refinement has never been more apparent to me because of a growing awareness of the Holy Spirit, his work and his voice. I'm acutely aware of the sins of my heart, aspects of pride and bitterness, and he's quick to bring them to my attention. And rather than the shame that I used to feel, it's a relief, it's a joy, because I want God to refine me. I want to look like Christ. I don't want to live as I once did in the flesh, full of carnality and resentment and heartache. So I can look back and say that where I'm at today really began in that time, that place, and the chapters that I described.